So far we've learned about basic syntax and an overview of the JavaScript language, so we know a little bit about variables and functions and if-else statements. In this lecture we're going to get further into loops and arrays. Now, fortunately, JavaScript supports multiple types of loops and similar ones to Python, but if you're familiar with Java, the loops are going to look very similar. Java and JavaScript support the same types of loops. The only real difference is that in Java we have an int type that we usually use in for loops, but otherwise these are going to look pretty similar. So while loops, again, if you're familiar with Java, this is going to look very much like what you see in Java. And it's very similar to the operation of the Python while loop as well. In this first loop, we're going to count from 0 to 10, not inclusive of 10, and we're going to output 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that's because we're going to enter the while loop, we're going to evaluate that condition, and as long as that condition is true, we're going to execute the steps of the while loop. We're going to get to the ending curly brace and we're going to go back to the beginning and continue to iterate until that condition is no longer true. The second loop is a little more complicated. It's going to start off with I now is going to be 10, and we're going to divide it by 2 if I is greater than 2, otherwise we're going to subtract 2, so we're going to count backwards in this loop. But both of these loops are just sort of executing as long as a condition is true and continuing to iterate until it's no longer true. Now, in JavaScript, we also have a do while loop. Now, these aren't terribly common, but you do see them from time to time. And the purpose of the do while loop is it evaluates the condition at the end of the loop as opposed to the beginning. So that means that the loop will always execute at least once. So in this example, if the value of the variable sum is 1,000 and x is 12, then you end up with 1,012 because even though sum is greater than 100, so the condition is not met, it's still going to run once. So this is nice to know if you ever need to run or create a loop that will execute at least one time. And you may encounter these in code that you read from time to time. Now, for loops help us to avoid the infinite loops. Every programmer who's written a lot of code will eventually forget to add an incrementer or write a while loop that doesn't ever terminate, or sometimes even a for loop. But for loops do help us to avoid infinite loops because they kind of embed the counting and they allow us to create a counter variable that is within the scope of the loop. So if we take a look at this, this first set of sample code, we start off with I equals 0. While I is less than 0, we output the value along with this string, and we're going to count through an array, which we'll get to in just a moment. And then we add 1 to I. And this is pretty much the same as this code on the bottom where we start with I equal to 0. We're going to continue while I is less than 10, and we're going to increment I. So it works pretty much the same. The only real difference is the scope of I now is outside of the loop, whereas in the for loop, the scope of I is inside of the loop. So we can use that variable over and over again as a new variable instead of having to, reuse and reset the variable we've already created. In a for loop, we tend to call this first part the initializer, we tend to call the second part the condition, and we tend to call the third part the incrementer. Now typically that's a plus operation, which is supported in JavaScript, unlike Python. But you could also have plus equal or minus minus. There are a lot of different ways that you can have that last part of the loop. And here are a few examples of for loops. The first one is just going to count from 0 to 10, non-inclusive of 10, and output that result. The second one is going to count from 50 to 100, non-inclusive of 100, by 5s. So you can see here I plus equal to 5. And then this next one is kind of interesting because you can see we're actually using a string literal as an object. So we can actually use a string literal as an object, and we can use its methods and its properties, just like it were a regular old string variable. And you can see we can even actually access each one of the values in a string by its character or by its position. So we can kind of treat a string a little bit like an array in this way. Speaking of arrays, arrays allow us to create multiple values for a single variable. So this is kind of nice if we need to build some data that is related or we need an associated group of things. And the arrays allow us to, basically declare a list or a set or, some group of related data and put it all together. So in JavaScript, we can define an array just like we do in Python. We start off with the variable and then we set it equal to the sequence of values in brackets. Now, you can also create another way to create an array is to use this new array. Basically, identify a variable and then instantiate a new array with values. This is a lot less common, though it is something that you can do. So you might see that in code from time to time, but generally this first approach is preferable. Now, we can add values to arrays just by, well, one way is to just put them in there. You know, we can create a index for that array and we can assign something that way. It will work. It's very uncommon to see this particular approach. You know, now you typically see the push method to add values to an array. This is much more common. So we create an array here and then we push the values 20 and 22. So the array will have 20 and 22, two values in that order. You can also remove values from arrays. So typically, to remove from the end of the array, you'll see pop. So in this case, we're going to create an array. We're going to push 20 and 22, and then you can see here, let popped equals x.pop. That will have the value 22, and the array itself will be a linked 1. So the only thing left in the array at this point will be the value 20. Now, you can also use shift to remove values from the beginning of the array, but that's probably going to be a big O of n operation. Now, assuming you're running in a browser, you know, things will be consistent, but JavaScript can run in a lot of different places, so we're going to assume that that's probably a big O of n operation. So in this case, we're going to push 20, we're going to push 22, and then we're going to use shift to remove that first value, and now the array is only going to have the value 22, and its length will be 1. You can also use unshift. Similarly, this is probably going to be a big O of n operation because everything has to move to the right in order to accommodate that new space. But you can see we're going to use unshift to insert 7 at the beginning of the array. So now we will have 7, 5, 10, 15, 20 in this array, and the length should be 5. You can also reverse arrays just using this reverse method. You know, so in this case, we actually mutate the original array. So this will mutate the array, but it will also return a reversed copy of it. So, or a reversed version of this. So this is a mutator function. It's not going to, you know, it's not like it will give you like just return a reverse value. It will change the original array itself. Now, we can also convert an array to a string, and this is probably not going to be super valuable for anything other than debugging purposes, but we can take values and convert it to a string, and it's going to now contain the string W, O, R, D, S, which is, you know, like I said, probably useful for debugging purposes, but less valuable in practice. But you can use this join method on arrays to actually take the values of the array and join them together, and this is going to be much more useful typically. So you could, you know, even join with nothing, join with an empty string, which would take all of the values and just concatenate them directly into one string. And here are a few examples. You know, you can instantiate an array, and you can see we're going to output that, and you should just see the values in the array. We can push values, and they don't have to be the same type. It's not like Java where your arrays have to be all of the same variable type. In this case, we can put an integer, we can put a floating point number, we can put a Boolean, and we can put a string all into the same array, and that is totally fine. The only difference between Python is we use push instead of append. And then here we can put the values, you know, 0, 100, 200, 300, etc. into an array, and then we can see what that looks like. You can also use slices in arrays. Now, this is going to be similar to substring that we have in JavaScript, but the slices are actually going to operate very similarly to what we had in Python. It's just that in JavaScript, this is going to be a method on the array as opposed to just using the brackets notation. Now, you can also use instanceof to determine if something is an array. This instanceof operator is probably less common in JavaScript than it is in Java, just because Java has a pretty particular enforcement of objects and hierarchies and types, whereas JavaScript is a little bit more loose with typing. But you can use this to pretty easily determine if you have an array or if you have something else. So instanceof is another tool that you can use in your JavaScript. So hopefully this was a good overview of how to iterate using loops, while loops, for loops in JavaScript, as well as how to start using arrays in JavaScript. And we're going to continue our exploration of JavaScript in the next lecture. But for now, thank you for watching.